In today's episode, we're talking all about performance. From optimizing your training and recovery to fueling your body the right way, every detail matters when it comes to performing at your best. And just like nutrition and recovery support performance, having the right gear makes a difference too. That's why we're partnering with Altitude Sports, a Canadian company based in Montreal that's been helping athletes and outdoor enthusiasts gear up for over 40 years. They carry top brands like Hoka, On, Asics, Brooks, Saucony, Solomon, and more, plus apparel and accessories from Ciel, Garmin, District Vision, and the North Face. Everything you need to train well, stay comfortable, and recover faster. The best part? You can shop 100% online. You don't have to deal with crowded stores anymore. Just order online from home and get next-day delivery across Canada, or same-day delivery in Montreal. Returns are super easy too, no printer needed. To help you get started, use promo code SHAKEOUT to save up to 20% off on your first order. All the details and the link are in the episode description. Earlier this year, the popular endurance social media app Strava released heat map data revealing the most popular points traveled to by users. Right at the top of the list, public toilets. No matter what level of the sport you participate at, chances are you don't have to think back very far to recall a time when a well-placed porta potty became the only thing standing between your run and disaster. And while a robust mental map of every accessible toilet in your city is an admirable trait in any runner, it begs the question, is there a better way? From stitches to side cramps, tempo tummy to runs on your runs, digestive issues have long been a natural enemy of runners, particularly as the distances grow longer. Many a runner has shown up to the start line of a goal race in the shape of their lives, only to have a PB performance derailed by GI distress. You spent years tuning into exactly what your legs and lungs need to succeed on race day. Might taking the same approach to your gut be the key to your next PB? This week on the Shakeout Podcast, we're tackling the sensitive topic of sensitive tummies, diving into an exploration of the science behind gastrointestinal distress and learning how runners of all abilities can turn their fueling, nutrition, and the inner workings of their gut from a weakness into a strength. Here to share from her extensive experience as a registered sports dietitian is Jessalyn O'Donnell. As a member of Athletics Canada's integrated support team, Jessalyn has helped countless members of Canada's national teams achieve success at Olympic, Paralympic, and World Championship competition through optimizing their nutrition strategies. She joins the show today to share the same tools used by elite athletes with runners of all abilities to help you get the most out of every run. Jessalyn, welcome to the Shakeout Podcast. So excited to have you join us today.
Thanks so much for having me, John. It's a real honor to speak to you and to be able to speak to my experiences as a sport dietitian and working with runners of various levels on a fairly complex, but to me, a pretty fascinating topic.
It certainly is a complex one, and I think it's one that every runner, regardless of ability level, you've worked obviously with some of the best in the world, as well as with everyday recreational runners, but I think no matter what level you're competing in or training in this sport, tummy troubles are something that will inevitably come up, and they've been something that I've dealt with in my own career as a professional athlete, something that for our listeners, Jessalyn and I have even worked in my professional capacity as an athlete through her role assisting Canadian national team athletes. And so I think a great place for us to start is really at what I imagine to be the heart of the issue. And that's identifying what some of the main culprits of gastrointestinal distress are, tummy troubles to call them in maybe simpler terms. Are there any specific culprits that you see time and again that are at the heart of a large proportion of athletes' problems with their gut and with digestion?
Good question. And asking questions around gut symptoms certainly is key to understanding the root of the issue and to fully flush out, I think, the best approach for each individual. Now, the symptoms I've encountered with runners I work with can be varied, whether it shows up maybe as upper gut symptoms like nausea, vomiting, reflux, burping, or maybe it could be lower gut symptoms such as bloating, gas, cramping, nausea, diarrhea, or some just aren't lucky and they could experience a combo deal of several of those. So for me, really understand these symptoms should be prioritized first before really jumping to figure out what that culprit is. And I should mention that if one of those symptoms is serious, like blood in the stool, a physician should be consulted to help assess and rule out gut disorders or more serious medical issues. But I also think it's important to really just step back and understand why one would experience gut symptoms during endurance exercise. And Ricardo Costa out of Australia, among others, has done a lot of really great work in this area. And from what I gather is that the gut issues could stem from a combination of factors. So when one is exercising, and let's just think about this, the body is busy directing blood flow to working muscles, to the heart, and maybe even such factors such as cooling the skin, especially if it's a hotter environment. And second to that, the stress response of exercise itself could impact the gut function. And so the outcome of this could result in the gut function really just taking a back seat, while the other body symptoms critical to running well become the body's priority, if that makes any sense. And so because of this slowed and perhaps compromised gut operation, one could start to experience those symptoms. And then we must also consider the nature of the sport itself could be putting one more at risk of gut symptoms. So you think of running, there's lots of bounding, there's impact, there's jarring, there's jolting. And this can all reduce gut function and possibly cause symptoms. Whereas maybe other sports, such as if we look at swimming or cycling, perhaps that isn't much of a thing and gut symptoms are going to show up differently because of the positioning of that sport. So just really get into the nuts and bolts of that question that you ask. On top of what I just highlighted, there exists other factors that could aggravate symptoms even further during exercise. So this could include maybe the exercise intensity. So ramping up the exercise intensity could predispose one to experience gut symptoms. Or maybe it's the duration of the running bout. So longer durations, particularly over 2 hours, this could also set one up to maybe have higher chances of gut symptoms. Now, in terms of my area, and I think this is like the meat of the question that you're getting at, I would consider the type and timing of food choices, but also the sheer volume of food pre-exercise that could be causing those tummy issues. So, I mean, you could be choosing pre-run foods that are pretty low risk in terms of gut symptoms, but just forcing too much air into a balloon, if we take that metaphor, is not a good idea. And the same with shoving too much food in the system, as the gut at some point won't be able to handle it. And maybe something else to recognize is the speed of eating. I've met with athletes over a pre-run meal to discuss gut issues, only to observe their meals being hailed before I can even say hello.
It's par for the course for competitive athletes to also be competitive eaters, I suppose.
Yeah, right.
Are there any maybe unexpected culprits? We talk about duration of exercise. You mentioned even going over 2 hours. My mind immediately jumps to marathoners and the amount of training that they have to do to strengthen their gut to be prepared. And we talk about types of food and quantity of food. Are there any unexpected culprits that in your working with athletes, they don't necessarily think of, but are oftentimes at play in terms of causing the GI distress that they might be experiencing or coming to you with questions about?
Yes, I've seen several, and a few come to top of mind. Number one being stress. Stress can make, things a bit looser. I would say that the majority of athletes I've worked with have had some sort of a component of stress contributing to gut issues. And this could be correlated maybe to pre-run nerves or just life stress that trickles into running. And of course, working with someone qualified in this area to help manage stress is an important one. Another big one I encounter as a culprit in runners is the use of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. So this could be ibuprofen, which is maybe a runner is used to manage aches and pains and sore muscles, but it can actually also be an irritant to the gut. And this is the same true with some of the supplements that we're using. Maybe someone's on iron and calcium supplements, and the side of that could be constipation, or, we've all, bicarb is hot at the minute. And I think a lot of us know that the risk of bicarb is the opposite. It's, one could experience loose bowel movements. And speaking of which, I do have discussion about period poops. And basically that's females experiencing looser stools leading into their period. And whether that cause and effect is of the period itself, I can't comment. It could also be related to the food and drink choices leading into menstrual cycle. But that just needs to be teased out. And I might say, lastly, just a big one. Apparently there's several that I have to raise here, but a big one is underfueling. So when an individual is not eating enough to provide the energy for their body's health needs, and on top of that, the energy needed to exercise, one of the possible consequences of, if dragged out, is that the energy that is needed for the gut to function could be compromised. So in essence, the gut is just not operating like it should. And as a result, one of the outcomes could be gut symptoms.
So simply cutting out food is not the answer to achieve a distress-free running experience. If we can acknowledge that, and if we know that we do need to be fueling in order to perform, I think any athlete is going to at least intellectually understand the importance of putting fuel into their body in order to perform, whether it's training, whether it's racing, just daily function as well. Are there specific foods that you as a dietitian working with athletes have found to be more effective in terms of a pre-race or a pre-training meal? Are there things that athletes, and I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush, can reach for, or just certain types of food that they should be thinking of prioritizing when looking at fueling forward and getting ready to either train or compete?
Yeah, really, really great question. And perhaps maybe I'll preface by saying that everyone's gut is different on what can be tolerated. So figuring out what works for you is key. But as a general rule of thumb, the closer to the event, so maybe we're talking, 3 to 4 hours leading into running, the recommendation is to choose simple carbohydrate sources like low fiber white bread products, or cereal bars, as these type of sources typically will settle best. And then saving those high fiber options like vegetables and fruit, and high fiber cereals and other grains, as well as high protein, high fat, spicy options outside of that 3 to 4 hour window leading into run. And I think the bonus to following this strategy is that those types of sources will help bump up your blood sugar leading into a run and top up your fuel reserves for your muscle and brain, which, of course, is also going to help you set well. So that's a bonus as well. On the other hand, if the event is longer, such as, maybe we're looking at 90 minutes to 2 hours, then also introducing fuel to your system during the event is recommended. And I know you did reference the marathon. So this is critically important in those events, given your body's fuel stores are limited and will need to be topped off. In this circumstance, it's really important to practice fueling during the event to get your gut used to the increased intake, and this is known as training the gut. So just like the introduction of a new workout could cause your body to say, "What the heck?" initially, and it might not feel normal. The same is true with your gut. Initially, it could cause distress if you're feeding it sources and it's not used to it during a run. But if you ease into it and practice, the body will adapt by increasing the transporters on the gut to help facilitate the increased uptake of carbohydrate. So I guess what I'm saying is, just because you read that pro runners are consuming, 60, 80 grams of carbohydrates per hour doesn't mean you should rush out there and do the same on your first attempt, because this could set up for disaster. And instead, working your way up to that target. And this could be starting with 20 grams of carb per hour, And maybe that's the form of a gel, and working up from there.
You mentioned the 20 grams of carb per hour. Are there any benchmarks or quick rules of thumb in terms of the amount of carbohydrate that the average runner needs to perform for, let's say, that hour-long duration? And maybe are there any examples that would be quickly recognizable to most of our audience in terms of a food source that might provide that level of carbohydrate as that primary fuel that they need to perform?
You referenced the 1 hour run. So for running for an hour, I think it'd be more important to focus on what you're feeding your body leading into it, because for an hour run, you should have enough stores in your system to be able to fuel that run. Whereas if we're looking more at the over 2 hours and even leading into the ultra, practicing filling your body with those carbo sources is going to be important, because your body just will not have the fuel to do that. So providing external sources is important. So what that could look like is, I did mention gels, that could be chews, that could be a sports drink. And even as we get into the longer races where, typically you're running at a slower pace, so you're taking the risk away with the gut symptoms that might be encountered with higher paces. An athlete might get away with a mix of foods that contain protein and fat in addition to carbohydrate, if this is the type of diet they habitually eat outside of running as well as are practicing during running. But still, carb is king. But adding that fat and protein sources to your training or in racing fueling could add variety, which could be a saving grace, as shoving endless gels over a 24 to 40-hour race can get old, fast, and boring.
Absolutely. The sugar rush of even a 2-hour run using gels is enough to make you crave something with a little bit more punch to it. You talked earlier about fiber and protein as two things that are crucial to general health and indeed to an athlete's long-term performance, but are not necessarily things that you want to be taking a whole lot of in those 3 to 4 hours before performing, whether it's training, whether it's racing. Could you speak a little bit specifically to fiber and the role that it plays? I think a lot of people, again, intellectually think of fiber as something that is meant to keep them regular, something that their body needs, but that they've probably had experiences where they've misjudged the amount of fiber in a pre-race meal and it's led to disaster or near disaster. What is going on in our systems as it pertains to fiber, and how do we make sure that we're getting the fiber that our body needs for general well-being without compromising our ability to compete and to train, and to just comfortably be out there running?
Yeah, a really great question. Dietary fiber, as you mentioned, is important. And just to take a step back to set the stage here, dietary fiber, we're talking about foods that are found in plant foods such as fruits and vegetables, whole grains, nuts, and beans. Then they have an important role in, helping you poop, as you mentioned. But yes, too much fiber can lead to diarrhea or a sudden urge to poop before, or worse, during a run, because those high fiber foods, especially those high in insoluble fiber like bran and other grain products, if too much can be consumed over a short period of time, this can speed up digestion and maybe a little too fast. And so to prevent this from derailing a run, it's recommended to limit or avoid high fiber foods leading into training, as previously mentioned. Now, that being said, everyone's different. I've known some runners to be able to eat their chia, flax, fruit, oatmeal, a high fiber breakfast leading into a run, and they're fine. Whereas for others, the thought of high fiber makes them want to poop. And so their pre-run food choices tend to be low in fiber, right? Everyone is different. So again, you need to figure out what works for you.
This is a bit of a tangent, but I know that there is research and at least anecdotal evidence as well to support the idea of, I'm going to call it a fiber cleanse leading up to competition. And this is something that's not necessarily for everyone, but I have heard instances of athletes cutting out fiber for a fairly extended period of time, 24 hours, 48 hours, leading into competition in order to kind of purge their system of any fiber that would take a long time to cycle out, to pass through, as well as to effectively shed a couple of extra pounds of what is matter that stays in the digestive tract. Can you speak a little bit to what's going on there in terms of cycling fiber out of a diet leading up to, say, a key competition, and when that might be useful versus where it might be an elevated risk for athletes?
Yes, for sure. Yeah. And that is a strategy that's out there. And I think, should be really only reserved with those that are perhaps working with a sport dietitian to make sure that they're not missing any important other nutrients while maybe cutting out those fiber sources. But, theoretically, if we look at that strategy, picking low fiber carbohydrate options, maybe a bonus is that you're going to be getting the high energy in because maybe you can tolerate more food in general when it comes to volume, and get in that high carbohydrate consumption that we would recommend leading into an event. But again, it all depends on the person. It depends on what their goals are and what type of race they're preparing for. And so maybe I would just say the bottom line is that working with a sport dietitian in that regard would be specifically important.
Right. It's the type of thing that you don't want to experiment with without professional help. You mentioned the ability to get in more quantity, and I think immediately of how much easier it is at times to eat a giant bowl of rice, let's say, versus a similar sized bowl of salad. Something that's high in fiber, takes longer for the body to digest, maybe leaves you feeling sated for longer, but not necessarily as easy to get that sheer volume of carbohydrate or fuel source in. And are you saying that it's important that, again, leading into competition, we are elevating those carbohydrate stores? I want to say they're glycogen stores. Is that correct? And what type of events do we need to be looking at raising those levels for, if any?
Again, it depends on the runner, but I would, and the events, but I would say for, if someone's training for maybe a marathon or a longer, then looking at making sure that you're getting enough carbohydrates into your diet would be important. But then again, it depends on, what that we define as high carbohydrate, and it's all relative to what an individual is eating before. If someone is not eating a lot of carbohydrates to begin with and they are preparing for a 10K, we want to make sure that they're getting enough.
What are some of the downsides of not getting enough carbohydrate?
Yeah, that's a great question. I know that there's been a lot of research in that area, and just stepping back and thinking about, what carbohydrate does. So number one, it's fuel for our muscle. It's the premium fuel for our muscle. So we want to make sure that we're getting enough because that's going to allow us to perform our best. But outside of that, if we step back and we look at carbohydrate and the other functions it might have, it's also the number one fuel for our brain. So, if our brain is also a very important component of performance as well. And if our mental function is not in a great space, then that's not going to serve us well either. And then outside of running, we're also performing. And, so making sure that we're fueling ourselves well in that regard is also important. So I do think that there is an important role in many ways for carbohydrate and should be included in the diet.
I want to take a moment to talk about another source of fuel that you mentioned earlier in our conversation, and that's protein. We've talked about the importance of carbohydrate pre-fueling. Again, it's that premium fuel that our body needs to function both cognitively and for our muscles, for our digestive system, for our lungs. When and where should protein be factoring into a runner's diet in order to maximize their performance and their recovery and, again, just their general well-being? Are there certain times in the day when protein needs to be the priority, and what are some go-to sources that people can look to in order to make sure that they're ticking that box?
Specific to, if we look back to the gut and leaning into a run, and how it might be used during that run, protein is going to be less of a usable fuel source. And if consumed too much, looking at the timing leading into it, could lead to gut symptoms. However, protein, as you said, definitely has a place outside of that pre-run. Consuming protein after exercise could help with recovery of the muscles used during running. And when we think of muscles, that also includes the gut, which we often forget is a muscle too. So, generally speaking, I think for most adults, consuming our snack or meal right after your workout that includes that 20 to 30 grams of protein could help with the recovery process. And then pulsing your protein intake throughout the rest of the day with snacks and meals could also continue to help with that recovery process. And I should add too that some of those protein sources, like dairy, for example, contain probiotics, like found in yogurt and kefir, or it provides some good bacteria that could add to that mix of diversity of bacteria that is found in the gut, which is related to a lot of health functions as well.
That brings me to another question that I wanted to bring up. You talk about pulsing our protein throughout our day, incorporating it into snacks and meals. And I wanted to ask your opinion, and based on your experience working with athletes, when and where should we be timing meals in general? Are you an advocate for kind of the traditional 3 square meals a day philosophy, or should athletes be looking at their fueling in more broad or general and fluid terms in terms of trying to be eating throughout the day or keeping that digestive system moving throughout the day? Is there a right or wrong answer, or are there certain strategies in terms of meal timing and spacing that you recommend for athletes?
One of the biggest gaps I see is not eating enough in general in the first 2/3 of the day, especially for those that tend to spend most of their energy during that window, which may include training and or an active job. And this could lead to robbing your body of the energy when it needs it the most to run well, but also, as I mentioned, to perform outside of running, whether it could be how you show up at work, or your concentration, or your mood, or managing emotions. And it can also show up in cravings later in the day at a time when many are less active and thus might not need that extra energy, which could lead to overeating. Which, speaking of the gut, could also not be good for gut symptoms.
Right.
Thus, in short, I think, eating carbohydrate, protein-rich meals and snacks every 3 to 5 hours, starting right when you wake up, and getting vegetables and fruit and other fiber-rich foods in your diet as well, throughout the day, minus those hours leading into a run, if that's a common gut trigger for you, is the best approach when it comes to eating schedules.
I want to propose to you a bit of a case study, and it's sparked by your mention of the first 2/3 of the day. And indeed, I think many of our listeners will empathize with the experience of trying to do their training on top of doing a full-time job, and they're waking up, they're getting their training done first thing in the morning, and then they're heading straight to work, and they're working all day before coming home and unwinding. For many, that first couple of hours upon waking up is a time when it's not necessarily the easiest to wolf down a huge meal, particularly if you know that you have to head out the door for a run. Are there certain snacks or foods that they could be reaching for to fuel that initial bout of activity, and then perhaps after they've completed their training and they're looking forward to the rest of their workday, trying to fit it all into a busy schedule, are there strategies that they can be incorporating to make sure that they're still getting the energy needs addressed in those first hours of the day, when you mentioned that it is so critical that they start fueling with the things that they need in order to stay healthy throughout the day?
Yeah, that's a very common routine. A lot of us are starved for time, so trying to get the training in before everyone else is up in the house is common. And I would say if you are one of those people, let's just looping back to our conversation around the foods that might be commonly managed well leading into a run, sticking to simple sources of carbohydrate just to get a little boost, just to, just so that you're not foggy leading into that run, and you're giving your muscles a little bit of fuel before you head out to it, especially if it's a run that's over an hour. And that could be, maybe you're someone that could tolerate a piece of sourdough with peanut butter, or maybe it's a bar and a yogurt if you're tolerating dairy. Okay. Just a little something. And then afterwards, when you come back, that's when you can have your bigger meal. So maybe it's not a traditional breakfast off the get-go. You're getting a snack first, but then you have your full breakfast after your run.
And that would be when you're trying to incorporate more fibers and proteins, things that are going to help with just general function and feeling sated for longer throughout the day. Is that correct?
Absolutely. That's when you can have your eggs and your toast and your fruit and your yogurt and everything else. That's right.
While we're on the topic of breakfast and mornings, another thing that comes to mind and is very near and dear to my heart, and I imagine to many of our other listeners, is coffee and caffeination. I'm certainly someone who can't even fathom the thought of getting out the door for my first run of the day without first caffeinating. That said, we know that coffee can be a diuretic, that it can accelerate food moving through our system. At least that's always been my understanding and my experience with it. Is there any advice that you can give in terms of balancing that caffeine hit that so many runners or people in general crave with trying to keep the gut working happily and healthily through training and then beyond into the rest of the day?
Yes, from a fellow coffee lover, I get this. I think the number one thing is to practice consuming your coffee pre-run and not shocking your system and one day deciding before your next race that you're going to add a coffee in hopes that it helps you race even better. As this could really, cause you to run real fast where that porta potty is and not the finish line. Instead, weaving coffee into your daily pre-run routine, if this is something that you really enjoy, so that your body again is getting used to it. And that's kind of the theme of our conversation with food and hydration as well. And, if it's still a problem, then start investigating that timing. Maybe you need to consume that coffee a little bit further out before your run. So maybe you're drinking your coffee 2 hours out instead of, slamming it 30 minutes to 1 hour before you head out the door. And also, be mindful what you're consuming with it. It's not just the coffee itself. Maybe you're having your oatmeal and chia seed mix work pre-run with your coffee, and that's the perfect storm to, causing you to have to hit the washroom pretty quick because you're combining it with a fiber source. So looking into those types of things are helpful. You may be looking at the volume of coffee could help. Maybe you do be better off with a shot of espresso rather than a drip coffee, or maybe considering caffeine substitutes like maybe it's a caffeinated gel or chew might sit better for you.
Right. Save the venti latte for post-run as the reward rather than chugging it before you're heading out the door. While we're talking about beverages, we've talked a lot about food. What role does hydration play in all of this in terms of keeping our gut healthy, happy, moving the way it's supposed to?
Right. Yeah, great question. Hydration is important. And I think, staying hydrated throughout the day is critical. And leading into event, you want to take small sips of fluid, and aiming for a pale yellow urine, not clear, as an indicator of hydration. Then taking fluid in during your event, depending on the length of the event, especially if it's over the 2 hour mark, because you'll be sweating more, and so you'll need to replace those losses. And that's going to look different for every individual, and working with a sport dietitian to figure out what that looks like is key, because we also don't want to overhydrate, because that could pose some health implications. But, you know, looking, so it's that fine balance between, I guess you could call it the Goldilocks approach. You want to make sure that you're getting fluid in, but not too much, because that could pose those health implications.
Right.
And I guess, you know, what I'm trying to say is that in terms of how it relates to the gut, it could, that extra fluid could facilitate how the food that you're also taking in and the fluid is absorbed into the digestive system. So that is key as well.
And is that why you mentioned earlier taking small sips, frequent smaller sips rather than big gulps? Is that why we want to be prioritizing that strategy, is so that we're balancing out the intake of fluid entering the digestive tract so that it's helping everything else move along and be absorbed more steadily? Is there a risk of overwhelming the system if we're just chugging an entire bottle of water right before running because we know we need to hydrate?
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. And I've seen this, you know, athletes chugging a whole 750 ml of a sports drink right before they're about to hit the track, and then consequently experiencing maybe some nausea or some reflux. And that's flooding the system. It's overwhelming the system. Just as you wouldn't eat a lot of volume of food leading into a workout, the same could be true for fluid. And we really need to consider that as a possible gut trigger if someone is experiencing those types of symptoms.
So what would a strategy look like in order to mitigate those symptoms? How long prior to, let's say, an intense bout of exercise, like a workout on the track, should an athlete be starting to think more intentionally about the types of fluids that they're getting in and the quantity?
Right. Yeah. And, you know, just like we were talking about how we would fuel throughout the day, I think, you know, alongside with waking up first thing in the morning and eating, you also want to make sure that you're hydrating frequently throughout the day. So that could be, you know, small sips leading right into that workout. And then during that workout, or training or race, if there's a station set up, you know, practicing making sure that you're getting fluid in as well, so that you're able to help replace those the sweat losses that are occurring during that event.
It seems like so much of this comes back to establishing routines to go beyond simply preparing for any one individual run or race or workout, and rather creating this holistic approach so that your nutrition cycle is predictable and regulated, in order to kind of repeat the success of good gut function on a day-to-day basis. We've talked a lot about some of the foods that we want to eat, some of the nutrition components, hydration. Are there other strategies that athletes can be doing in order to be more intentional about this whole mixture of factors that go in? I think of things like consulting with a registered dietitian, or perhaps keeping a food journal. What type of strategies have you seen work in your experience in terms of helping athletes educate themselves, and become more cognizant for themselves of what's going into their system, the effects that it's having, and how they can take control of those to improve their experience and their performance?
Yeah, great question. I think, you know, number one, adopt good day-to-day nutrition strategies. And that's not just in training, but outside of training as well, because that's going to, you know, support good health. And that includes a robust gut system. And this could look like eating a variety of foods, so not the same thing every day, and including and within that drinking fluids throughout the day, as we just spoke about, and paying attention to what your ins are. So what you put in your mouth and how that food and drink settle well for you leading into the run, and what doesn't settle well for you, and shifting those foods and drinks accordingly to other points in the day. I also, you know, would say pay attention to those outs. So those bowel movements, are they formed? Are they not? And paying attention to when there's a pattern of bowel movement not being formed, and making sure that you're, you know, if this is going on long term, seeking medical and dietitian just support. You know, I think a lot of things when it comes to health, we might ignore it until there is an issue, just like as, we might ignore the plumbing in our house. We might ignore the gut until it's an issue, and this could be costly. Thirdly, training the gut, as we spoke about, by incorporating those carbohydrate and fluid source into your training plan. If you have those big goals of running faster and taking on events that are 2 hours plus, and, assess and understand your triggers. And you alluded to this in your question. If you have gut symptoms, work with a sports physician and sports dietitian to figure out what these are. Don't attempt on your own, as you could unnecessarily eliminate important nutrients and really miss the bigger issue altogether. And lastly, really consider the big picture. Is it non-food triggers? Is it stress? Is it training or the nature of the event itself? Maybe you've chosen to do an ultra, and maybe experiencing a bit of nausea could be a common physiological consequence of the latter part of an ultra. But if the symptoms aren't really impacting how you perform, then maybe just tweaking your fuel during that time in the race so tolerance is better is all that's needed, and then you can just move on.
Tracking what we're taking in, also tracking what we're taking out. I think that's a highly critical one that maybe we need to be paying a bit more attention to, and seeking the professional guidance to make sure that things don't go off the rails. I love that you bring up the needless removal of nutrition that we do need in order to find the solution. That doesn't sound like it's the way to go about things. We're not looking for a scorched earth policy by eliminating everything until things start working. And that is really where sports dietitians like yourself can play such a huge role. Jessalyn, thank you so much for taking the time today to share from your experience, from everything that you've learned working with athletes of all abilities. It's certainly been very educational and informative to me, and it makes me really excited to incorporate some of these skills and some of these suggestions into my own training, and hopefully eliminate some of those unnecessary bathroom stops that are the scourge of so many runners out there. Thanks so much for taking the time today to be with us.
Thank you, John.
Huge thank you to Jessalyn for coming on the show this week and sharing from her experience as a sports dietitian. This is the second installment in our 2-part series on taming the tummy, how runners of all ability levels can take control of gastrointestinal health to feel better in training and maximize performance on race day. If you haven't already, I encourage you to have a listen to Part 1, where we hear from Dr. Jiwa Kuo, sports scientist and professor at the Education University of Hong Kong, researching the positive performance and cognitive benefits of defecation. If you're like me and have dealt with tummy troubles in your own training, we'd love to hear from you. Leave us a comment or review and let us know how you've navigated nutrition, fueling, and GI training in your own running journey. We've got plenty more exciting conversations coming your way in the weeks ahead, so don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts to make sure you don't miss a thing. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and X at Shakeout Podcast. That's it for today's episode. I'm your host, John Gay, saying thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you again soon for your next Shakeout.